back to our onliners. Well, again, I want to thank the committee for the topic of bold preaching, because it's not something I've worked a lot with. And, it was really helpful for me to take another look at that. All right, we're going to move into textual preaching or biblical preaching. I tried to strike a difference. It's somewhat obvious that we preach from the Bible, but I think as, especially as Lutheran preachers, we're pretty committed to preaching from a biblical text that is a single text and parallel text. So I'd rather use the term textual preaching. So let's start with a look at number 2. Try a definition without looking at your handout. In my functional definition, what do you think textual preaching is? Yeah, please.
Where the text, you're getting the stuff from the text rather than reading stuff into the text.
All right, so the platform is the text, and everything you're saying comes out of the text as opposed to you're bringing something to the text. All right, so it's text-driven. Okay.
I would add to that, like, translating the spirit of the text,
Oh.
the dynamic of the text.
All right. So it's not just about the language of the text. It's about the mood and spirit of the text. You're talking small s.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. Good. That's pretty insightful, actually. Thank you. Go ahead.
Maybe reiterating your point that it's the text addressing the context rather than the context determining the text.
Okay. All right. So the text shapes the sermon, not the culture or the context of the congregation. Yeah. As much as that's possible. We try to let the text do the work. Yeah. All right. Anybody else? Please.
Yeah, I often think in terms of long gospel preaching, because I see this pattern where it's almost like the pastor has decided I'm going to just preach law and then gospel, and then whatever the text says, I'm just going to squeeze into that somehow.
Yeah.
And almost like the text is just like the platform to you talk about it for a few minutes, and then you jump off to what you really want to talk about. So that when you're doing law gospel, it's really taken from what the text actually brings to the table.
That's really good, and we'll talk about that in just a second. Very insightful. And I think a lot of us we impose. I get into trouble for this. I've gotten in trouble before, but we impose a law-gospel dynamic onto a text and make it do what we want to do it the way we want to do it. Right. And the text may not have any law in it, and you have to import law from another text, which is fine. It's okay to do that, but we force what I call the hybrid structure onto the structure of the text, and in effect muffle the text's own movement by law gospel. And I've said this at conferences, and I get nice emails. No, they're very nice. They're just saying, boy, you sound like you're putting down law gospel. Not at all. I'm just saying, don't impose law gospel to the extent that you muffle the structure, the natural structure of a text. Let the text do your structure. Just let the text do your work, for heaven's sakes. It's all there. Yeah. Somebody else.
But to your point about, as recently, that's kind of one of my more recent developments in my learning and preaching is that, like, if you have to look really hard for the law in the text that you're preaching on.
Often the case.
Like, is it okay then, if you're preaching the text, to have very little law and mostly gospel, because that seems to be what the text demands of that.
Not if you're a Lutheran preacher. It's not okay. I'm serious. It's not okay. Who was it? I'll think of his name. Just Will Willimon at Duke wrote a lot of homiletics texts, and he said if he's reading or preaching out a text from Amos and there's no gospel, there'll be no gospel that Sunday. You won't hear the gospel. You'll have to wait till there's a gospel in the text I'm preaching. And man, he caught it from all over the place. This is 30 years ago, but he should have caught it. So we import gospel when it's not there. We import law when it's not there. And that's the beauty of the unity of the scriptures. You can do that. But not to the point where you don't let the text speak. You don't want to muffle the text in the movement. Yeah.
I like Rev Rosso's concept of gospel handles.
Right, right.
And maybe law handles too.
No question. I mean, he would say there are law handles as well.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yes.
It took me a while. I used to think just in terms of a single Sunday. with that law gospel paradigm, and it took a while till I figured out that paradigm fits across Sundays. That some Sundays it's going to be a little more this way, some Sundays it's going to be a little more that way, but I need to think of a larger picture. Does that make some sense?
It does, yeah. And you hope whoever was there this Sunday comes back.
Exactly. That's my main concern.
Yeah.
So you always have both,
Yeah.
but it's also playing out longer term.
Well, I think there are texts where the gospel overwhelms the law. And I like to hear sermons like that. I mean, I'm quick to believe I'm a filthy sinner. I mean, I don't have to work too hard on me for that. But boy, I need some convincing about I'm forgiven. So I like intentionally loading it with gospel, but there are some Sundays where maybe the topic of the text really asks you to do more work on the law side, because you have to really convince people that their prefigured world is a mess. Yeah.
At Revelation 7.
Yeah.
It's like, it's heaven, you know, it's like there's, you know, the law, like, it's, you know, it's pictured.
But you set it up perfectly. You set it up that we're left just, is this what we're stuck with? You know, are we at the end of everything now? I mean, that was a great move. It's set me up to hear the gospel. So you didn't just let the gospel picture show up. You also brought us.
It'd be kind of cool just to have something.
Yeah.
Just enough stuff.
All right, we got to press on. So here's my textual preaching functional definition. Textual preaching engages a biblical text to the extent that the text itself drives the preparation, structure, content, and texture of the sermon. So what I'm pushing for is not just the writing of the sermon. I'm saying every aspect of homiletics is driven by a biblical text. Every part of your preparation and delivery are driven by that text. Most of us have seen this picture of Luther. I have the original hanging in my study at home. Wouldn't that be great? But Luther there, with his one hand on the scriptures, there's that textual driven, but also the Christ-centeredness. Christ crucified, but also Christ risen with the unfurled banner, with his linen cloth. More than one commentator has noted the shadow, that this is a real Christ, not just an image of Christ, but the real Christ who casts a shadow. There's Luther with his hand on the Bible. This is by Lucas Cranach, the senior, who was a member of his church. Here's the Christ figure. See the shadow in the corner? There it is. And just for fun, I started looking at the faces of the people that are in the congregation. Some of them his own family, Luther's own family. The artist is up there. You can see the artist up near the top of the picture. But when you look at some of the faces of people, you see this girl, who's obviously distracted. And this guy, I'm not sure what he's doing, but he's not paying attention to either Martin Luther or looking at the cross of Christ, which made me feel really good. And you can have Martin Luther in front of you preaching and you're distracted. She looks like she's looking at the artist. So he painted her. And so there's got to be I'm an art history buff. There's got to be a story of that girl and Cranach. That somehow they're related to each other, I think. But I don't know that for sure. So I use this when I do my workshop for lay people on how to listen to sermons, which is a fun thing because lay people love to talk about your preaching. And for years as a DP, we do that. At least in our district, we had a list of 25 qualities of a pastor, and you were supposed to number the one that you valued most in your future pastor. Call committee, we meet and go through that. And repeatedly, the number one thing they asked for was a dynamic preacher. That said dynamic preacher. So I finally got so tired of hearing that at meetings with call committees. I'd say, you know, it's about time we have some dynamic listeners out there too, you know. Some people who really listen to sermons. And we really have to say that's not a bad percentage of the congregation. If you don't
I think that guy in the back is actually texting.
That's good. All right, anyway. Benefits of textual preaching. Enhances the biblical literacy of the congregation, obviously. Teaches the language and vocabulary of the Bible. People learn the language of the Bible, which in many ways is a language unto itself. Keeps the authority of the preacher where it belongs, in the Word. We press that again and again. The authority of the preacher is in the Word. So he's in the Word. He's always in the Word when he preaches. It fully engages the dynamic power of the words of the biblical text. They're not kind of tossed away quickly as you move into your sermon. So why would preachers ever leave the biblical text? We may assume personal or hero familiarity with the text. They already know the story of the prodigal son. You mean I have to tell it again? Well, they may not know all the aspects of the prodigal son. In fact, it's episodic. There's one episode, then another, then another. You can preach a sermon series on the prodigal son story. I did for Lent. The whole thing of familiarity makes us not preach the text. We may move easily and quickly to topical preaching. So faith is the substance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen, Hebrews 11:1. Faith, do a sermon on faith. So you read the text, maybe talk about the text on page 1, and now you're into a topical sermon on faith. You've got all kinds of parallel texts, you're doing a study on faith, and you've left the text behind that was rich in itself, but you decided to do a topical sermon on faith. So the topical thing isn't as popular as it used to be, but I think it's an enemy of textual preaching. I think it moves us away from our text too quickly. By the way, I can overstate things sometimes. You could disagree with me, that's okay. We may impose hybrid rhetorical or theological structures on a text. We already talked about that. Not just law gospel, we might come with a phenomenological move. David Buttrick, I don't know if you were taught that at seminary, but 2.5-minute episodes of the text give people 6 to 7 experiences of the text. We impose that on the text. The good thing about that is the text is engaged in all of those. But there are some where, let me think of another structure. We make the text fit into the structure. I guess the law gospel is another hybrid structure that we've talked about together already. We may lapse into our formulaic cliches for law and gospel. So we ignore the text's own language for law and gospel, or for one or the other, and we fall into our cliched gospel. Or we may eclipse the textual narrative with more engaging external narratives. So there's a beautiful story in front of us in the text, but we think we have more beautiful stories that have to be told. And we tell those stories instead of the beautiful story that is in text. And that's a shame that the beauty of the scriptural text is not observed and celebrated. I know I moved a little quickly through these. That's on purpose. All right, preparation. So we said so far that preaching engages biblical text to the extent that the text itself drives the preparation of the sermon. So we talked a little bit earlier this morning on eating the scroll. This is my method of eating the scroll. Leans a little bit on Dietrich Bonhoeffer and a few others. Bonhoeffer's wonderful book, Meditating on the Word, where he made his underground seminary students every morning meditate on the Word, and he made the rounds through their studies to make sure they weren't doing other things. They were meditating on the Word. I found that to be a very helpful resource. It was published by an Episcopal house, which has no right to publish Bonhoeffer, but they did anyway. And it was very instructive, really impacted my life. I use his system of meditation personally, apart from my sermon preparation, but it also is a part of sermon preparation. So what you do is you read the text aloud first several times. You do that, you vocalize the text, listen to it. Remember that for the first 1,000 years after Christ, probably very few people, if any, thought they would ever just read a text in their thought. If you saw a written text, it meant you read it out loud. So when Joshua 1, 7 or 8 says meditate on the word day and night, that word meditate is mutter. Literally, it means to mutter. I grew up in Chicago. Mutter's the opposite of fodder, but mutter is to utter aloud. So I find vocalizing in text very, very helpful. By the way, we were talking earlier this morning, a couple of us, that vocalizing, David Schmidt vocalizes his sermon and then writes down what he just heard himself say. And then does some more vocalizing and writes again what he just heard himself say. But the hearing of the text is really important in terms of preparing to preach a text. Then I bring my own tentatio, Luther's term, in Germany would have said anfechtung, my own trial, my own hardship, and I let that word speak to me, both law and gospel, but it speaks to me personally. So again, before I'm going to presume to preach this word to anybody else, it's going to have its way with me. And I found that in this process, I find the direction usually of my sermon. So paraphrase the text from the Godward side. I've journaled this for years, as if God is speaking to me from this text. So do not be anxious about anything, but by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, make your requests known to God. Philippians 4, 6, 7, 8, somewhere in there. So don't be anxious about anything, but by prayer and supplication, make your requests with thanksgiving. So Dean, I noticed you're really uptight about this conference coming up in the Eastern District, and you're spending a lot of time thinking about it, and I haven't heard a lot from you in terms of prayer. It'd be great if you could pray a little bit about that conference and consult me a little bit before you go and get on the airplane and go to Rochester. And by the way, have you thought about giving me thanks for the opportunity that I'm giving you to share with the guys in the Eastern District? That's a paraphrase. And boy, when you look back over those paraphrases that you journal, they're amazing. Because they're like a diary, only God's commentary on your life. What God is saying through the text to you. So the paraphrasing is very, very helpful. Identifying a personal central truth in the text. What in one sentence is this text saying to me? How do I narrow this down? You mentioned Fred yesterday, I think that was helpful for you to get the text down to one sentence of meaning. And then praying the text back to God. When I began meditating this way, preparing, my prayer life took a quantum leap because I allowed God to speak to me first, and now my prayers were informed by what God said to me in His Word. And I often wondered, even as a young pastor, how do people spend a half an hour in prayer? I mean, I've done it 2 minutes. But when you begin to meditate on the Word and then pray the Word back to God, your prayers easily go 20 minutes, half an hour. Mine do. Just on the text before you're even doing your intercessory stuff as a pastor. And then finally, consider memorizing the text. I don't know what there is about memorizing that I love so much. I pushed it through my whole ministry. We always did 100 verses in 100 days every other year, and families did this together. Every day you got to memorize a Bible verse, one each day for 100 days. You had an oral exam at the end of each week to make sure you kept up. And the amazing thing about this was the amazing ability of junior hires to memorize, and the amazing inability of adults to memorize. That they lost the skill somewhere along the line, which was really tragic. But I remember, this is his name, Tim, at the faculty of the Senate, came the same time I did. Tim Seleska. Thank you, Seleska. His dad once preached a sermon in the chapel and he was on the faculty at Fort Meade Seminary, preached in the chapel at the St. Louis Seminary. 21 memorized verses in a sermon, never blinked, just recited them from memory. I'll never forget that. In about at number 15 or so, I took a Bible and started checking them out. It was word for word. I thought, yeah, right, you're reciting it from memory. He was reciting it from memory. You don't do this for show, but I'll tell you, when I listen to a preacher that has parts of his text memorized, I know he's been there. He's been there. This text has him. So I encourage you to spend time memorizing, especially the shorter ones, to do that. Please, comment.
So John Seleska spoke to one of our student groups about 18 years ago. And he did the same thing the whole weekend. And I saw his Bible, which was completely blown
His
out.
Bible's amazing. I've seen pictures of it.
And,
Yeah.
and I said, Dr. Schlesinger, how have you memorized so much scripture? He looked at me and said, it was a whole lot of work.
That's great. I've not heard that before.
He has them written down on his hand.
Oh, no, he's cheating?
But that's,
He was
each week-
memorizing.
Each week he would learn
Okay.
one text, and then he says, when you do this over an entire year, 1 week, you take 1 week, you just absorbed into that one text. By the end of the year, you now have 52 texts, and over the years, you have...
That's great. I thought you meant he was up there like... That's a great insight. I had never heard that from John. Please.
I peeked ahead in the cheat sheet here. The question that I have, because I do it, I don't know other people do it. Where do, this preparation, eating this scroll, where do other resources come in? Where do commentaries and doing the searches, Luther's works, and maybe Luther's sermons, and study Bibles, and Pressman, Lensky,
Yeah, that'll come up with engaging the text for preaching. But we haven't thrown exegesis out. I mean, that's where you start. You start with, if you can do the original languages, but if not, the commentaries do them for you. And you want to get at the original context of the text and the original meaning of the text as much as you can. Things have changed hermeneutically. From when I got out of seminary, we were reading Christopher Stendhal, who said there's only one original meaning for every text, one meaning. And your job is to get there and find that meaning. Whoa, that's a challenge. Now, especially in light of Jim Veltz, at least in our circles, with his book on hermeneutics, which 70% of it I don't understand, but that's just me. I'm just saying, I don't get it all. But he created a whole new nomenclature for hermeneutics, but one of his most significant insights for preaching is his idea of the receptor of the text. That the receptor, not necessarily just the original writer, but the receptor of the text, the one reading it, the one hearing it preached, they shape the meaning of the text. That's a quantum leap. I'm surprised he didn't get crucified for that. I mean, in our circles, to say that the text may mean what you, the hearer, came wanting it to say. But haven't we experienced that? After a sermon, somebody says, Pastor, what you said today about being in the hospital and not knowing if you're going to come out alive or not, and you're thinking, I didn't really talk about that. I didn't really address it. How are you getting that out of it? But you don't say that. You say, oh, I'm glad the word really worked through. But so, I mean, we've always known that. But that doesn't give us an out, and I've said this to Jim, it doesn't give you an out not to do the hard exegetical work to get at the core meaning of that text as much as you can, and put it into a single sentence that will drive your sermon. That you'll go back to that sentence again and again, at least cognitively. Yeah?
Just to put in a word for the old-fashioned stuff, if you can, read it through in the original languages. For example, I've noticed that some of the modern translations go pretty woke. And
Really?
Yes. And another one is you take Psalm 32, just the one word, sin, but Hebrew has 3 words, and they're loaded with meaning. Honesty, and iniquity means twisted, and twisted into yourself. And when you're imprisoned in yourself, that word gives you all kinds of resources.
Yeah.
Wow, how do I get
And
out?
you know, my experience with that is, maybe because I'm a Greek geek, but I've often heard it said, don't use Greek in the sermon, but if you can give the background to a pivotal word in a text, people love it.
Yeah.
They love it. You've had the same experience.
Yeah.
And you may not even have to use the Greek word. It doesn't mean much to them here, but if they hear it sometimes, it just works. So I've never bought the idea, don't use any of the original languages. Use them, because they can often open up a word for you with meanings you never had before.
If you talk to them, if you have an addict that's been, or someone who's been addicted, that being turned into oneself and unable to escape is loaded.
And look at how picturesque that is, how image-driven that is. Yeah, that's great.
Hebrew does that.
Right, yeah. All right, on the back page, we already kind of touched on engaging a text for preaching. the original context and meaning, that's the exegetical word. Central thought, we've talked about that. Look at the language of the text. We were just talking about that in terms of looking at words and language, and are there some, especially picture words. I did the thing with Romans 3. Are there words that raise images in their mind? So I loved how, again, Fred, you had us. Can you see this? Do you see this? That's what we need to do in preaching. We need to have people see the text, imagine the text. If you've not read the book on imagination by, help me with the author, Gene V. Excellent book on the role that the imagination plays in the law gospels imagination, where imagination can take us that isn't helpful, and where it really is an amazing gift. Engage the imagination. Look for the following, law and gospel. We've talked about that, how sometimes they're both there, sometimes not. What are some great images that come forward in terms of presenting the gospel? Christology, finding Christ in the text, why Christ is necessary in that text. Here a depiction, so important in terms of presenting the law, showing them that prefigured world. Relationships. I feel like I missed, oh, there we go, relationships. Again, I can't emphasize that enough in the life together of the congregation, that it builds on one's relationships. I remember David Schmidt saying once that for a while when he was in the parish, he would think of one or two people in the congregation and write the sermon for them. I always found that interesting. It would be hard not to look at them. But he said it was very helpful to put the sermon into a relationship and to speak from that relationship. I like that a lot. So you're looking for what in this text actually speaks to the relationships that we have together as a community of faith. Yes?
What are your thoughts on like audience participation in the text? So like Revelation 7, one of the first things that came to my mind with the image is like how insane it would be to be in an uncounted multitude all yelling like the same phrase at the same time. And so one thought that jumped into my head as I was listening to the sermon yesterday was, we're going to be saying that same thing when they're there, so why don't we say that right now? And so having the congregation say that salvation belongs to our God, is that a good strategy for engaging the text?
Yeah, it's a white guy's call and response. No, I think it's great. I would do that often with them. I'd use a refrain. I'd say the first part of it, they'd come back with the second, but to take a piece of the text and have them say it and start quiet and build and have it get louder and louder. Yeah, that could be great. I think we need to experiment with that. That says that the preaching task is a partnership, that you're involved in this too, to invite that. I think that's great. Yeah, please.
I think of the title of Keller's book, Preaching for the Church. Implied there is preaching through the church. The idea that they're going to take this home and apply it in their world and communicate it in their world.
That's right. Definitely. Good title for that watershed work. Looking for suggested enhancements. You're thinking about how can I enhance my sermon with a story or an illustrative point that you're going to make. Sometimes there are clues for that as you read through the text. One of you mentioned already the moods of the text and the mood swings. I've enjoyed preaching sermons where I try to reflect, like if you're preaching on a psalm, starting really low and kind of downcast and talking that way, and moving up through a really celebrative affirmation of faith at the end that's very proclamatory. But to reflect the mood swings of the text, watch the movement and transition within the text. Where does the scene change? Where does the thought change? Is that where your sermon will change? And then obviously the searching for parallel texts becomes very important as well. I've always loved this etching by Rembrandt It's one of 2 etchings he did of Christ preaching. I'll plug my book. It's on the cover of my new book here. And it shows Christ preaching very informally. There's another very formal depiction of Christ preaching by Rembrandt. But what's most important about this is this little guy down here that he puts at the base of the etching, which, now I'm going to put the best construction on this, okay? That he's hearing Jesus say something that he thinks is worthy of imaging on the ground. He's taking notes. He's imagining what Jesus is saying and putting it down. He's put his little toy aside, and he's drawing with his finger, like Jesus himself did, into the dirt. Some image that Jesus is raising. Maybe Jesus is talking about lilies or sheep or something. Who knows? But I love that because it raises the concept of image related to preaching, which we're going to talk about tomorrow morning, and how image is crucial for you to be heard when you preach. That's a beautiful etching, isn't it? Yes.
I love it because it's exactly what I see on Sunday. Kids with the children's bulletins using the pew as their desk, and their back is toward me or sideways, and they're and make no mistake about it, these little kids are listening and they are absorbing.
Yeah.
I agree. Yeah, this idea that
they may be coloring, but they're listening too.
Yeah, and sometimes their coloring might even reflect what the pastor's saying, or they're coloring a picture of the pastor that they're going to give them on the way to church. Yeah, please.
And the converse of that, I don't know if people are doing much ministry in nursing homes or whatever. People whose minds are gone or going and they're essentially like children kind of react the same way. But the word is still getting there. They're still attending and listening.
Google Visual Faith Ministry if you're not familiar with it. A couple of our district president wives are very active in that, Connie Denninger and Pat Meyer. It's a movement of encouraging people to take visual notes of sermons. I should have put one up here. A woman sent me by email her visual notes of one of my sermons, and I was amazed at what she picked up visually from the sermon that I preached. But
could you repeat that?
Visual Faith Ministry, and it's a movement within the Synod, but it's getting bigger than the Synod now, toward actually helping people visualize sermons and visualize their meditation on the scriptures. You can order Bibles that have space on them for drawings. So if you're artistically inclined at all, but I do it, and I'm not even artistically inclined in terms of being an artist. I just love images. So Visual Faith Ministry puts this to work for adults and kids. Kids can do it as well.
My wife's quite involved with that too.
Oh, she is? Good.
Mike, your wife is as well? Isn't your wife?
She's blogged about it and using
I think she's gone out and done workshops on it, and my wife does too, from the congregation.
Super.
Connects with the other lady.
Great. All right, let's just look quickly at a few sample sermon structures. Should do a little work on structure. We said that the text drives the structure, so I'm not going to put up here what I call hybrid structures, because they often eclipse the text. Not everybody likes it when I say that. I think running the text is what we're accustomed to. It's often called expository, where you take a phrase or a verse and stop, speak, and then text comes back. Never leave the text. The text is always there. You talk a little bit on the verse or verses, and then go back to the text until you're done. Text interrupted is you begin right away with the text and telling the textual story if there's a story there, but then you interrupt it. So if you're doing the prodigal son, for instance, what do you think would make a son desert his family and his father and take his money and run? You interrupt the text with a question that's going to get people engaged with the narrative. Works really well with narrative text. So you interrupt the text, and you might interrupt it 3 or 4 times. It's a little different from running the text, and then running the text is more like expository, where you're taking a phrase at a time. Text delayed is where you hold off on the text. You did a little bit of that in your message. We didn't get the text right out of the gate, but we got a setup for hearing the text. That's delaying the text, getting people ready to hear it. Some people do this just with their law and gospel. So the law is delaying the text because there's no law in the text, so they're going to bring it in. They're going to spend time on the law, and then here comes this text on a white horse. It's so cool. You know, that with the good news addresses that law. So that's text delayed. Text framed is you have an opening volley, maybe an illustration, a poem, something, a piece of art. It sets people up to hear the text. They hear the text, you preach on it, and then you go back to another illustration or story at the end of the text. The point of these structures, and we owe it to David Schmidt for giving us, people don't realize this isn't around all over the homiletics literature. David Schmidt did this. So we should be thankful we got one of the premier homileticians in the church developing nomenclature like Jim Veltz and hermeneutics. This is happening with David Schmidt in homiletics. Single text imaged. These are image text. I don't think I got these. I think tomorrow we're going to deal with these. But single text image is where one image is used to kind of encapsulate the text, and you stay with that image. You don't leave it, you come back to it again and again. Multiple text image is where, for instance, if you're doing the prodigal son, since we're talking about that, you could have several depictions of the prodigal son story. I think I'm going to put one up tomorrow of the prodigal son lost among the pigs that Max Beckman did. Scene change, again, you structure the sermon with the different scenes or episodes in the text. Character perspective, I once heard a great sermon on the prodigal son. I can't remember his name now. He was a Brazilian prof that was at the seminary when I was there. And he preached from the perspective of the older son. Took him last. The younger son, the father, and the fatted calf. It was really a well-done sermon. It was just a character perspective, and it worked. Works very well with narratives. Works super well, like the parable of the tenants and the early and the late comers and so forth. Just works really well. And there's a new approach. Exposit the text. Get the text in front of people so they understand it, they know its meanings, its central meaning, and then apply it to their lives. A lot of Luther's sermons are like that. If you've read Luther's preaching, if you haven't, a lot of his sermons are text-plus application. Yeah. Please.
I found a lot of times that the lectionary readings will build on each other, and if you're preaching through all 3 or 4 readings, or even tossing the intro, would you call that scene change, or how would that be classified?
If they serve as parallel text, the epistle reading is not designed to do that. It's like the continuum. It's just a reading. It's not meant to relate to the first reading in the gospel. But the intro, the sound, the first reading and the gospel reading, definitely you've got some ready-made parallel text to work with. Once in a while, the second reading will actually relate to thematically to the first reading and the gospel. Yeah.
Yeah, in our tradition, I think it's good if we can try to distinguish and wrestle with the difference between the word and scripture or the text. One is much bigger than the other. One help I had with that was when in Luther's table talk stuff, when somebody was talking about what makes a woman pregnant, Luther said the word. The Bible never did that. The word, yes, and the word is what came to Jeremiah and says, I break and I build. And that word's still doing it. Whether we have a text or not, it's happening.
All right, thank you. I think we'll be able to wrap this up maybe. Use the language of the text throughout the sermon. Don't leave the language of the text behind. That's the language of your sermon, the language of the text. Find a refrain or textual hook to bring the hearer repeatedly back to the text. There might be a phrase that you can use that brings them right back again to the text. And go first to the text for the articulation of the sermon's law and gospel. Wayne K on cliche law and gospel, we talked about that. Here's Emily Dickinson's poem, Tell all the truth, but tell it slant. Success in circuit lies, too bright for our infirm delight, the truth's superb surprise. As lightning to the children eased with explanation kind, the truth must dazzle gradually, or every man be blind. Take time to relay the truth. Be gentle with the truth. And in her case, as Gene Peterson found this poem and used it so well, tell it slant. Come at it by coming around to it. And don't put it smashing into people's faces before they can truly receive it. I think it's some really good counsel. And again, he puts this together with the travel narratives in Luke, and Peterson says when Jesus was preaching, teaching, he was conversing. He used the language of conversation. All right? Just about done. And we talked about some of this already. Textual enhancements should be driven by the text. Your mood should reflect the text. Your intensity, how intense your voice is. The imagery you're using for your sermon. The stories you use. And the integrity, that is your own personal ethos, should be an embodiment of that text. Because you've eaten the scroll. It's who you are, this text. All right. Just want to let you know that this is offered to you at a special discount rate. I haven't really done this before. Conferences, it's $15. At Amazon, it's $20. Lyle's been good enough back there. If you have $20 bills, he'll give you a $5 bill back, and you can take it with you. This is a book that looks at the aesthetics of preaching, makes avid use of Aquinas, Luther. Luther didn't say a lot on aesthetics, but a lot of he appreciated aesthetics, and Jonathan Edwards. And then he has a couple sermons in it, and looks at a lot of artwork. So the reason it's as expensive as it is because the Seminary Press actually put full-colored art into the book. And this is all art that I've used in my preaching that you could maybe use in yours. So
It's got pictures.
yeah, it's got pictures, full-colored pictures. Thanks. See you tomorrow morning, I guess.